we did all sorts of projects. And one of them was the food forest. And it was a bunch of neighbors that came together, and they were doing different guerrilla gardening projects, or they had chickens illegally in their backyard, or, there was like a range of different innovations around urban agriculture, and they were enthusiastic about food. And it was like, I just remember being at these meetings, and like the food table would be mobbed. Like more people would go to that discussion than any of the other discussions happening in the auditorium. And there was a food forest in the news at that time because it was being built over in Seattle, on Beacon Hill in Seattle. They built a food forest, and that was getting national publicity. And so folks in Boston were like, we got to do one too. We got to show up. We got to represent. And in between that, moments of conversation, they were going and they were gleaning apples from legacy apple trees that had long been planted in parks and yards throughout Boston. And they were learning about the existing fruit orchard that already here is in Boston. And they came up with the vision that a food forest in Boston shouldn't just be in one place. It shouldn't just be like the Beacon Hill food forest in Seattle. It should be all of Boston as the food forest. So what they really wanted was to connect these atomized spaces and neglected and forgotten trees with new intentional permaculture gardening and ecological agriculture, and really share and create a community of practice and invite neighbors into that through these volunteer stewardship teams that do all the work. So they do the snow shoveling, the trash removal, the weeding, the pruning, the harvesting. They do it all. And it's all volunteer. So those volunteers get to decide where the fruits of their harvest go. And sometimes they take their share of apples or things that they love. Sometimes they have put it in brown bags and gone door to door to neighbors they know are needy and offered them food. Sometimes they've put it out on tables and with a sign that says, please take some, and let other people just sort of bag their groceries like a CSA might. Others have literally formed relationships with like Women's Lunch Place, which is a homeless shelter that feeds folks in downtown Boston. And so all the food grown at the Old West Church food forest goes to feed folks at Women's Lunch Place. Others have made partnerships with like elder service nonprofits like Rounding the Bases, which does cooking classes with the elderly. And so the food has gone there. Others have brought it to their churches and distributed it that way. So it's really, it really varies, and it can change as the relationships change. And another thing that a lot of these sites do is they have an annual harvest festival. So before COVID, this was a more active part of what we did. Was a lot of community gatherings. These are not just farms. These are public parks. There's outdoor movie nights. There's open mic nights. There's Easter egg hunts and birthday parties. There's Wake Up the Earth barbecues. There's, harvest festivals where we make apple cider at the end of the summer. I mean, there's face painting, and it just goes on and on, like what people have imaginatively made come alive in these spaces. Like the Leland Cooperative Garden up the street from where I'm living now was created, I think, in the 80s and 90s. And it was like a trash-strewn, vacant, neglected city lot with hypodermic needles and, tires and TVs. And the neighbors came together to clean it up. And they started planting trees, and they started putting in grow beds. And then they got a little bit of funding here and a little bit of funding there. And they were moving plants from their own yards over there. And they were learning as they went about gardening and teaching each other, and then having potlucks in the winter, and brunches on Sundays, and then at a certain point, we did garden raisings where we would go to people's private yards, and in an afternoon pound out a new permaculture garden, like an old-fashioned barn raising, only it was taking what was like barren lawn and transforming it with native perennials and plants that are good for the pollinators and the birds, but also are food producing, like raspberries and blueberries and apple trees and peaches and other things that people want in their yards. And so it was fun, and people would learn by doing, and they would like learn about all sorts of aspects of that, how to plant a tree, how to prune a tree, what these different plants are and their various ecological uses and their various medicinal uses for humans. And it's just a lot of fun. And it's like a little switch goes off in your head when he's like, oh, let's go do a collective work day in so-and-so's backyard. You're like, that doesn't necessarily sound like it'd be as much fun as it really is. It's like you have to be there, sweat, and then look back and say, wow, look what we did together. And a pro-social switch that you didn't even know is in your primal brain gets flipped, and it's like you get flooded with endorphins, and it's fun because we like to work together. It's what our ancestors did. It's just like that's how we've been expanding and growing, and there's just an increase of interest in what we're doing. and more volunteers knocking on our doors. And what we need to do is find the resources to hire enough staff that we can basically harness that energy and really be effective in absorbing that volunteer energy. Because and then you layer into that just rainwater capture, right? So the rainwater runoff is a big problem in most cities. Here we're capturing it on site. It infiltrates into the soil. Carbon sequestration, and even the intangibles, we don't know 100% why flowers and trees prevent violence in city neighborhoods, but we absolutely understand that that's a true thing. Like urban planning schools, you study that correlation, and the causation is a bit mysterious, except that there's also all these psychological studies saying that even just an image of a tree reduces stress and cortisone levels in the human body. So it's primal. We like having trees and flowers around, and it helps us be more peaceful and kind to each other. And kids who grow up with regular and consistent access to green space, it mitigates long-term adverse mental health outcomes, which is a big issue in urban youth. So, and they've shown that urban youth who have access to safe green spaces do better in the long term. It's a very peaceful intervention that has potentially long-term impacts. Another thing we could do is in Boston, we've the Army Corps of Engineers put a lot of the streams under the ground into culverts and tunnels, and so we don't even know we're driving over these streams. And yet the foundations of buildings built near these spaces, they just go through chronic disrepair because they're harder to maintain because it's not real. The ground is actually overstreamed. So it's why not just let those buildings collapse where they don't want to be, build higher density in other parts of the city, and resurface those streams and bring that riparian nature back to life and plant around the borders to prevent flooding and make those borders beautiful parks and food forests that permeate through our city. I mean, we can imagine it, and it's definitely technically feasible. And prior generations built all types of infrastructure, not necessarily always the best choices, with modernism and their assumptions about life. But now we know better. Let's make better choices and take the same resources, and before it's too late, and start. And as you're pointing out, more and more humans are going to live in cities. So let's make cities really livable.
I'm thinking about how much food we might be able to produce locally for people to eat as sort of even a national security issue, really, because we may have really difficult times ahead. And I think our current farm system has given us plenty of food over the years, but should not be taken for granted with climate change and pandemics and whatever else. I mean, I got thinking about food security so much during COVID-19 with all the lockdowns. When I went to grocery stores and half the shelves were empty, I'm like, oh shit, this food accessibility I've taken for granted my whole life really should not be taken for granted. So what you're doing is really adding a layer of security where if the current systems struggle, you can go out back and pick some apples or some berries or grow something in your yard or, have access to more food locally.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. There's a truth that we've all been experiencing, right? Which is we have this really efficient, globally integrated economy, including the food systems, and it's incredibly brittle. It's very efficient. It's good for on-demand restaurants where we sit down and we want to be able to eat exactly what's on the menu whenever we order it. And so we have a system that really does provide that and provides it relatively cheaply. So that's efficiency. But boy, is it brittle. It's a little bit of a hiccup, and all of a sudden there's shortages and delays and things. I mean, and that we're just at the beginning of the perturbances we're going to be experiencing with increasing, deepening climate change and what is definitely going to feel like a period of increasing global chaos. So it's scary because we're all of a sudden aware that, I'm plugged into this system, and if the system stops working, I don't really have another alternative. Where do I get my food? Or, and absolutely, back in the day, even back in the 50s, it was a much more regional food economy, and you had different regions of the country specializing. But now so much comes from just a few counties in California, and it gets trucked all over in refrigerated carts. So yeah, we got to rebalance.
And those California places are running out of water too.
Exactly.
That California food may not continue. So sorry to interrupt, but
No, but that's exactly right. I mean, so we have to rebalance. I mean, it's like whether we choose to do it consciously and rapidly now, or whether we're like forced to do it out of necessity and panic later, like it has to happen. Definitely public policy matters. You know, there's a time in the 40s, I think, where we really figured out a whole bunch of public supports for local family-owned farming. And then we dismantled those to centralize farming in the hands of large agribusiness. I mean, that was a public policy decision. And both systems depend on a lot of public subsidy. So it's just a matter of how we want to direct that subsidy. It's not like, do we need subsidy? I mean, we have it. We've always had it. Farming's always had it. So it's more like, who do we prioritize, the local family farmers or the large agribusiness? Now, again, the large agribusiness is great at the monocropping and the efficient system that we have that produces a lot of meat and a lot of other things that we really like. So it's not a simple transition, but it's also totally an unsustainable system. You know, it's destroying the topsoil. I mean, we could go on and on. It's impoverishing people. It's, even as it's creating so many calories, we still have underfed, malnourished folks in our world. So it's like, it's not even succeeding at its minimal job. So we need to change that industrial food system. And that is definitely going to be like the USDA Farm Bill. You know, we have to change that. I mean, so public policy is huge in this.